Okay. So you'll kind of hear that naming conventions. Typically, and what Ryan was saying the other day is you kind of want to, in terms of directories and naming things here in this side, you're going to want to stick with all lowercases, hyphens and underscores. Typically kind of stay away from spaces and capital letters. It's pretty much just for the naming convention, making things usable, findable, things like that. CSS kind of picks up a lot after that. Oops. Where it's typically going to be all lowercase, and we're going to utilize hyphens and underscores.
And to add to that, just when you hear naming conventions or we talk about semantics, like this will become more common to you the more you work with it. But like the whole point of when you're writing your code is you want it to be readable. Well, obviously for the browser to easily to interpret it and put it up there correctly. But you also want it to be readable for yourself when you come back to it the next time. That way, for some reason you weren't in the flow and then you're like, what the heck did I just write? Like, this doesn't even make sense. So you want to try to name things, stuff that makes sense to you, as well as, if someone else is looking at your code later and working on it with you. So this is a nice class, says it straightforward. It's the header, and it's going to be on the right. And that kind of went with what we were talking about with semantics, with the sections, and how he's done header and nav here, so it's up in the header, all that stuff. You want to make it as readable and make sense to you, so you don't have to decode the code itself.
And there are practical reasons for coding conventions. One of the practical reasons for coding conventions is just it signifies social signaling. So social signaling, when you're looking for work, that you understand how people write code. So there's generally accepted ways in which people write different code, and different languages have different coding conventions.
Oh God.
But if you know that the generally accepted coding conventions for language, people are like, okay, good, you know how to do it. The second reason is that semantics is important to SEO, search engine optimization. So if you want Google to return your website natively, organically, when somebody searches for whatever you do, their algorithms look to see how did you code your stuff. And if you coded it poorly, they won't even be able to understand it. If you coded it mediocrely, they'll understand it, but they'll say this is a mediocre coder, it's going to get a lower rank. If you coded it to best practices, current industry standards, it will be able to understand
Almost.
it,
Just need to
and
throw
it'll
it on the
know
right
that
side.
you know what's going on in our good coder, and you'll get a higher rank. And then the third reason you really want to use coding conventions, like header dash right, we're using that for class name, but when we get into web components, and we start creating our own tags, so there's header
Nth
dash
children?
li.
Nth children?
In web components, we'll be able to create our own tags. And the way browsers know that this is a custom-created tag is the tag is with dashes. So header right could be a tag instead of a class. And I could just make that my own tag. Or I could create a tag, Todd-header, or my site-header, and just put that tag in, we'll bring it in. But that coding convention tells browsers this is a custom tag using the dash. You don't use an underscore, you don't use camel case, you use a dash for custom tag. Sorry, all the people on the video didn't get that.
Yeah.
What he was talking about is custom tags for semantics. So by default, we have these things for header, nav, ul, li, and a tags. And for classes, instead of having classes header right, we can simply have a tag. And a good example is just to do header right. Oops. All right, I guess Emmett doesn't like that. Header right. Which is perfectly valid HTML per XHTML standards and XML standards. One thing I would note about that is that any kind of custom tag will default to inline. So I mean, you're not going to get the default styling that your browser will contain for you, which is actually kind of nice because that right there, your tag is your reset. So instead of having to import CSS resets and things like that, you can actually use that. It's perfectly valid, semantically makes sense. So like this, you can actually make it say Todd right.
Well, that's web components.
Yeah, that too, yeah.
Yeah. For now, just stick with this.
And the point of all that's just that coding conventions are important for
Yeah.
main reasons, which I went over.
Definitely. So one thing I did here, and it was kind of quick, and I apologize for anyone who didn't see
At
that.
this point, does everybody understand what we've done so far? Other than if you might have been a little confused with that just a second ago, like the custom tags. But everyone understands what we're doing with the list items so far? Anybody have any questions? All right, cool.
Okay. And then for this one, we just gave it an ID of circle, and what I plan to do with that is for this right here, we'll actually just color the content white, and we'll put a little red circle in there. And that will actually touch up kind of on this is how we can actually give images as kind of border radius, images that also applies to any kind of element as well. So for now, I guess we can simply throw this on the right side, and what we're going to do for that is we want the entire nav to do it, and yep. So coming back here, we gave it the class of header right, so that's the one I want to target. And we can simply say float right. And another way of doing this and how Google did it was they simply positioned it absolute and gave it a right of 0. This will accomplish the exact same thing.
Can you add that in, and we can just comment it out and see the, hey, that does it, that does it.
You want to show them?
Yeah. So you said JavaScript. All right. So this is just to show that position absolute and float right will accomplish the exact same thing. And here we go.
So one thing, does everybody remember why, everybody remember what absolute, position absolute does? Remember that? We did it yesterday with the forms. So does anybody remember why this works? Why it automatically goes to the top and the right here?
So absolute is, I don't know if I should answer.
Well, she was looking excited. She was.
Go.
Was it's relative, just relative to the parent or the whatever's above it?
There you go. Perfect. So what it does, yeah, basically yes, exactly. So what it does is when you have a something positioned absolute, it looks for the first parent that doesn't have a static positioning. Remember, and everything has naturally a static positioning, every element. So in other words, we didn't find any parent elements that have static positioning, so then it just did it relative to HTML, the body.
And what absolute essentially will do is it will break it from the flow of the document object model. So it kind of disregards a lot of things. So if this was actually contained in something, this now just left that container. All right, so that's just simply to show that we can accomplish the exact same thing, and I'll just actually, oops.
Thanks, that's awesome.
And we'll go ahead and put our float right back in, and we should not see a single change. And refreshing quite a bit, we have no change, so we just accomplished the exact same thing. And floating will allow us to stay within this, which will be great. Like I said, the header will actually have, whoops, that's not good. The header actually will extend the entire width of the page, but if you notice here, the header actually doesn't even have height to it. Yeah, so doing float right and position absolute right 0, it won't actually tell you what it is, but float right will actually kind of associate that element as if it was position absolute as well. So having anything float or having anything position absolute, it's now left the regular flow of the document object model, which is why the header now doesn't have any height. But since it does cover the entire width of the page, and we float it right anyway, we can stay consistently within it. And if this was a div and we set this to 50% of the page and we did float right, because a div is a block element and kind of has that inline block attribute, this would not float to the entire right side of the page. It would float to 50% and would still be within the width of that div.
So is there any advantage to one or the other?
Using
Absolute versus float?
floats one line, absolutes two. Really doesn't matter. You can use flex. You could pretty much do it. There's a million ways to do one thing. It's just kind of your preference on how you want to take it.
Yes, sir.
So float versus absolute, you don't have to use a clear with absolute.
Right.
Right. And
You said float versus absolute, you don't have to use a clear.
that's a really good point there. For clear on that one, we have this thing called clear fix, and it's if you have an image. If you have an image that was floated right, the container actually wouldn't wrap around the entire image. So what we do is we have a clear on the image that will make the element wrap around it.
If you want to toss it in there, we have go to that CSS style. Go all the way down to the bottom. It's up to him. If he chooses float, then we'll need it. Yeah, we'll need to clear the float. Depends on what you're.
And here's a good example. So clear both, we have.
Yeah, we went through this yesterday.
Okay, cool. Never mind then. All right, sounds good. Okay, so back to this and back to what we currently have. So the Google homepage, it kind of has this padding right here to the right. And it looks like we don't just yet. So we can actually just go ahead and throw that in. This header right here, we can simply say, yep. And I think I'm actually going to want to use margin on this. And the reason why is because it will be targeting the space outside of the element. So we're not actually affecting the width of the content inside the element. This can particularly be good for borders. If you use margin, it will actually apply space between the border and the following element, whereas padding will be padding between the content and the border and the next element will be neck and neck. And if you had two elements with the same exact border color, you would essentially have double the border width. So that's the reason why I'm going to follow through with margin. And I just want to target the right side. And can give this something like, let's do 25 pixels. And then now to see this in action, we can now see that there is a bit of a margin here for me. And so for the Google homepage, we have that same kind of margin here. And when we hover over this, with the inspect element open, yikes.
Julian, can you show where's that margin right
Sorry,
there?
it's hard for y'all to see because we can't see the full right side of the screen.
We can actually,
Can you just make that a little smaller on the right side? There you go. That way you don't see it.
okay, perfect. So yeah, this is where it's at right here. Yeah, they're actually using padding. Padding is noted by the green container. Margin's actually noted by the orange container. So I guess in the,
case,
yeah.
Same background color, but
And actually, in this case, it really doesn't matter which one you use, padding or margin, since there's really no element aside from Google down here and then the footer. So it's really just preference on what the actual page will consist of. Like multiple backgrounds for one thing, you're probably going to want to use margin over padding. So they did actually use padding here, and I guess I can actually just, I'll stick with padding.
go ahead and do comment out float and keep position absolute.
Okay. And I think I actually kind of want the position absolute here. Yes. Because we'll eventually have to clear it anyway, and position absolute may actually be a little bit easier. So I just went ahead and commented out float right, and I'm leaving position absolute and right 0 inside there as well. Yes. Right, actually, we have,
So remember yesterday when we did the position fixed and we said bottom right? So it's by default it goes top left to whatever it's positioning. So since we already have, and it goes top left 0 0. So you already have top 0 because that's default, and by the right it's saying we want this to position itself all the way to the right, 0 pixels from the edge. Okay.
Julian?
yeah.
What's making it come down from the top? Because I don't, my line of elements is right up on the very top.
If you're using a CSS reset, actually the unordered list is going to remove the margin, and by default, unordered lists have a margin of 16 pixels on the top and the bottom.
I don't have a reset set in.
Huh.
What browser are you using?
Let's save individual troubleshooting until after the presentation's over.
Yeah, but you didn't do anything to make it come down.
Yeah, I just removed the margin that's making it come back down. That's this margin here in the unordered list. And then if I take that back out, it will just go ahead and reapply it there. And if you notice here on the right side, we now have this green little square. Same exact, that's the padding reference. So on here, they actually have quite a bit of space between each of the list items. That's really useful for touch targets. Google standard says 45 pixels between each. Obviously, they're not abiding by their own rules. Doesn't really matter, but we have these things called touch targets. This, you might have a little bit of hard time for viewing kind of anywhere. Instead of hitting +Ryan, you may actually hit Gmail, and that's not really what we want to do. So what we can actually do in that case is we can go here. For each list item in here, we can actually go padding. And I don't really want anything on the top or the bottom because the unordered list margin will take care of that for me. But I definitely do want something on the left and the right side. So the reason why I went 25 pixels, the unordered list margin. So having the margin in there of 16 pixels will take care of the original padding on the top and bottom. Yeah, I don't want to contribute to that extra height. But I would like to contribute to this extra padding right. 25 pixels is actually kind of small, so between each element I can actually just go 10 pixels, and this will actually be top and bottom 0, left and right is 10 pixels. And now coming back to it, we kind of have this, this gap here, and it contributed just a little bit more to this right side, and it will give us a little bit more of the same kind of flow as what this has.
And just an anecdote, that's actually perfect design minimum specs, because the minimum specs for a touch target, they say, is 45 pixels. So you got 25 padding right plus 10 on left and right would be 45. Did you design it that way, or is that chance?
That was chance.
Nice
That was all chance.
45 pixels.
All right, and it looks like we have just some kind of anchor styling. Not a huge fan of sans serif or serif fonts, especially on websites. So I'd like to just go in here. And we had the Helvetica new in the previous example, followed by Helvetica, if Helvetica new is never available, and the last one is Arial. And if none of these fonts are available, then we'll simply stick with the sans serif font. And this is going to kind of go in order of compatibility. Helvetica new is the default font of Macintosh, Mac. Helvetica is kind of in between. It's not fully compatible, but you're likely to find a Windows machine with Helvetica on it. Arial is a default font for Windows, and Helvetica new and Arial kind of look very similar. And otherwise, if neither are available, we'll just stick with the generic sans serif font. Yes, absolutely.